Across the Ukraine, Belorussia, the Baltic states, the streams of refugees gathered, traveling by whatever means they could, stunned in fear of their lives. They knew only one direction, east, into the heartlands of Russia. They took with them whatever was most precious. Hundreds, thousands, tens, then hundreds of thousands. The streams became a flood. Stoically, patiently, they waited for their only hope of salvation along the railroads already being bombed and strafed by Nazi planes. In Moscow, the Soviet government had established an evacuation council by the third day of the war. It had to deal with a forced exodus of millions and reorganize an entire economy. One of the organizers was Alexei Kosygin, later Prime Minister of the Soviet Union.
We had to withdraw for a period of time from the most developed areas of the country, for Russia traditionally grew from the west to the east, as, say, the United States started from the east coast. We no longer had our iron and steel in the south. We no longer had our main arable lands. The fascists overran our main coal source of the time, the Donbass. Of course, you remember only too well how in the summer of 1941, from the western regions of the Soviet Union, an endless stream of people, equipment, food, thousands of factories, millions and millions of people moved to the east.
To dismantle assembly lines, strip down the machines, load them into ships and trains, factory after factory, with the sound of the guns drawing nearer and nearer. One important war plant in Leningrad was dismantled after the city had been surrounded and was rushed out of the city through a gauntlet of Nazi shell fire. The workers left Leningrad with the machines and were resettled in Siberia. They were back in almost full production in days. For the train crews, every mile was a hazard as they traveled within range of the Nazi bombers. Closer to the front lines, the railroad men were even within reach of the German guns and any stray Nazi planes wandering the battlefield. Yelena Shuknyuk was one of the engineers.
Я сначала не знала. Думаю, ну что такое? Вот шатает вот так вот паровозы, вагон и все. А это через нас...
The German front line had already reached Yefremovka station near Moscow by the time I got there. Then the engines started to shake. Large caliber shells were flying right over our heads. Shells that size created a vacuum, and the engine and coaches would shake back and forth. As I pulled into the station, I picked up speed. Then I saw the aircraft overhead. I thought, they're going to bomb us now, and I slammed on the brakes. The bombers had counted on my moving fast, and they missed me. All the bombs exploded ahead of me, and the train was safe. Sometimes, though, it didn't work that way. Just as I hit the brakes, they dropped the bombs. I think of that as my contribution to the war effort and to victory. At Stalingrad, I was burned all over when my train was hit. All the dresses I had with me burned, too. I had nothing to wear but my uniform.
In the first 6 months of the war, 1,500 military plants were snatched away from the Germans. Train after train steamed into these alien lands that were still Russia, the Urals, Central Asia, Siberia. It was like moving the industry of Illinois to Alaska. On the collective farms, the farm tools were driven across the fields for the last time to be transported to the virgin lands of the Soviet East. When there was time, the livestock was patiently herded to far-off pastures. In haste, with the enemy approaching, they salvaged what they could. The rest they burned or buried to deny to the Germans. In the first year of the war, nearly 10 million people were resettled in the East, the biggest migration in the history of mankind. After the first welcomes, there would be occasional conflicts, inevitable in a movement of such magnitude. But together they worked to get the plants back in production, in factory buildings that did not yet exist. The earth of Siberia was iron hard. They had to blow it open to lay the foundations of the new factories. Concrete and steel were in short supply, but they worked through the night by the light of bonfires and torches. In the Siberian winter, the workers' hands froze to the metal of their shovels. They built a total of 2,000 new plants in the Urals and Siberia, more than one a day before the war was over. Some kinds of production had never been seen there before. The East was no longer a new frontier. It was the Soviet Union's industrial heart. Factories came before homes for the immigrants. The strangers from the West, the people from Moscow, Kiev, the Don Basin, Leningrad, shared what was available until their new cities could be built. Nazis. Design bureaus and research institutes had come east with the war plants. They produced and tested the machines that would prove superior to what the Germans could send against them. Sergei Ilyushin, designer of the famous IL-2, better known as the Sturmovik, was a ground support aircraft. The engine and the cockpit were heavily armored. The fuselage was built of wood. It was difficult to destroy and easy to repair. The Germans christened it the Flying Tank. In action, the Sturmovik was formidable, especially against Hitler's panzers. Russia's reserves of manpower, vast as they were being stretched to the limit. The battle line needed men, but so did the assembly lines. The gap was filled by those who had already earned a few years of rest. The old taught the young and remembered their own skills. Now their textbooks were the lathes, the drills, the presses that turned out the armaments for their fathers at the front. This boy's father was killed in action. The majority of the workers were women. They too learned unfamiliar skills and unwelcome sorrows. A woman might put in as many as 14 hours of back-breaking work at the plant, then go home to cook and care for her children and elderly relatives. And this, knowing only that her husband was at the front, far to the west. The work demanded the utmost of body and mind. No Russian woman had ever operated a blast furnace before. It called for strength, great skill, expert judgment. Faina Shuranova was foreman of a blast furnace.
Вначале я даже не знала, что люблю ли я, по сознанию ли я пришла работать. А вот когда мы выплавили первую кладку, сделали это специальный чугун, так вы знаете, я на всю жизнь полюбила эту вторую домну, и даже до сих пор.
I really grew to love that work. At first, I didn't think about likes or dislikes, but I think subconsciously I wanted to do it. Then I made my first fusion. It was a special kind of pig iron, and you know, it made me take that number 2 blast furnace to my heart forever. Even today, I just love it. I talked to her like a friend. I'd say, there, my dear furnace. You've got to know, my dear, how much we need that metal.
It had been an upheaval unprecedented in any society. The transfer of the greater part of an economy and a huge proportion of the population to undeveloped territories 1,000 miles away, and there to establish the equal of any industrial power in Europe. And finally, to outproduce the formidable plants of Germany. As the war ground westward, each battle produced new refugees. Many came to the east to start their lives again. But it was the tide of the gigantic evacuation of the first 6 months that made eventual victory possible. 10,000 tanks, 100,000 planes, cannon by the thousands, rifle and submachine guns by the millions, ammunition by the tens of millions of tons. This was their achievement. With tears and sweat, they had rebuilt the Soviet war machine, more powerful than ever. They had turned loss into overwhelming strength. Now the trains traveled without hindrance, at full speed.